Good evening. Welcome to the University of Washington School of Law. My name is Dongsheng Zhang. I'm Associate Professor of Law. I'm the Director of the Asian Law Center here. We are very, very delighted to welcome Professor Shi from China today. This lecture was brought by the collaboration between the law school and Jackson School. So I'm really grateful for our commentators from Jackson School tonight for Professor Shi's lecture. It's always a great pleasure to work with our sister school program. I want to say that at the law school we have a variety of courses on Asian law. We have Chinese law that is going on now. We also have Japanese law. So today, for those of us who have been studying law from the legal side, it's very, very exciting to know more about substance of international politics. And especially the pleasure of welcoming Professor Shi from Renmin University, because I'm also a graduate from Renmin University, even though that was a long time ago. This lecture, Zhi Xin will, the chair of the student organization, will introduce Professor Shi by giving you more details. So I want to welcome everybody to tonight's lecture. So Zhi Xin.
Good evening. I'm Shi Yinhong, President of the Committee on China-U.S. Dialogue. It is my greatest pleasure to welcome all of you here for our fourth event in the China-U.S. Dialogue Lecture Series. It is also our special event commemorating the 40th anniversary of U.S.-China relations. I, on behalf of the committee, would like to sincerely thank you for coming, especially after the disruption of all the snow days stuff. So this year marks the 40th anniversary of China-U.S. relations, especially diplomatic relations to be precise. The relationship has its ups and downs during the past 40 years, but the engagement between the two countries was generally considered as mutually beneficial. Now it seems like we're at some kind of tipping point when we reach the situation where China-U.S. relations are in a rough period down the road. In times of deteriorating China-U.S. relations, we find it imperative to build a bridge of understanding and communication for civic engagement in Seattle for arguably the most important bilateral relations in the 21st century. So this lecture series is made possible through the leadership of our committee and coordinated effort of the sponsorship from the Confucius Institute of the State of Washington, the UW Jackson School, the UW School of Law, and Hua Voice Radio. Such efforts also has to do with the populist upsurge in recent years in the Western world, which, living in a post-truth world with the current administration, especially, that it is hard for us to uphold democracy in the civic engagement platform, which is what we exactly are aiming to do through these kind of events. Some housekeeping announcement first before I introduce our speaker. So I'd like to inform us that please silence your phones and please do not use any devices out of the politeness to the speakers to record any audio or video of this event without the speakers and our prior permission, but please take photos as you want. And as always, views expressed by the speakers do not represent the view of the committee or its co-sponsors. And please feel free to take any feel free to tweet or blog anything on your social media or anything, because we've been receiving some kind of misperception about our policy. I would like to clarify that at this event. So after our lecture, an edited video recording of the event will be posted on YouTube, and you have the YouTube address at the brochure you got when you came in. So during the Q&A session, please do not raise any questions that are irrelevant to the topic of today. We reserve the right to stop such activities when necessary. Today we have our special guest, the first guest we have from Beijing, and was a well-respected international relations scholar for decades and is a legendary figure. So Professor Shi Yinhong, who's a professor of international relations at Renmin University, also chairman of academic committee of the School of International Studies, and director of the Center on American Studies at Renmin University of China in Beijing. He has served as a counselor of the State Council of China since February 2011. He previously was a professor of international history at Nanjing University from 1993 to 1998, and a professor of international relations and director of the Center for International Strategic Studies at International Relations Academy in Nanjing. He also served as the president of American Historical Research Association of China from 1996 to 2002. So Professor Shi obtained his PhD degree from International History at Nanjing University in 1988, and an MA degree in the History and U.S. Foreign Policy at the same institution in 1983 to 1981. He was a visiting professor at Harvard Yenching Institute from 1983 to 1984, a visiting fellow at the Federal Institution for Eastern European International Studies in Colorado in 1992, and the list goes on. He taught several graduate courses as visiting professor at American universities, including University of Michigan, and several universities in Japan as well. So Dr. Shi's focus in his research and teaching primarily on history and theory of international politics, strategic studies, and East Asian security. He has over, at least until 2012, 520 professional articles being published in academic journals, magazines, and newspapers, as well as 15 translated books, mainly on strategic history and international politics, being published. So I'd like to extend my sincere welcome on behalf of the committee to Dr. Shi's visit to Seattle, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Shi for this lecture.
It's my great pleasure and honor with all of you this afternoon, and for which I would like to pay my greatest gratitude to all the organizers of this event, and especially and to Mr. Gao and the chair of the Committee on China-U.S. Dialogue, and for this event and the event tomorrow. And he paid, I think, great efforts in organizing and connecting with me. And also, and a special thankfulness were paid to Professor Helmer, with whom I'm very fortunate. Before, I think 2 weeks ago, and he just visited in my school, and we have a very, enlightening, conversation. And I learned a lot from him. And of course, only one sentence issued by Chair Gao, I will make some revision. I'm all exact legendary figure. And so this is, I think that this is my great pleasure and honor. Thank you all. And it's my, great chance to listening and expression. And today, I would like to make a talk entitled and the China-U.S. rivalry, and in the recent past, at present, and in the future. And I believe that the 5 talking points already issued to at least most of you. So, and I also thanks for very tolerant policy of organizers. Give me as many as 50 minutes. So I think that it's more than sufficient. Thank you very much. Thank you. China-U.S. relationship in the past decade was primarily, I believe, capitalized by rivalry rather than by accommodation. First in strategic front, then in both strategic and trade fronts even more. So in situational sense, the relationship has ups and downs with often dramatic vicissitudes and so-called offensive or defensive postures was adopted by either in different times. But structurally speaking, I believe the primary dynamics for increasing rivalry laid at China's side, while the United States was conditioned in general by sort of historical defensive concern or so-called grand strategic posture. Founding one after another, the major preponderant positions the United States had possessed for a long time lost to China or eroded increasingly by China. In the past decade or more, China, whether under the remarkable, compared to weak top leadership of Hu Jintao, or under the all-powerful one of Xi Jinping, had been a drastically risen great power, boosted in international state by drastically increased national strength, both economic and military. Partly compatible and partly contrast with Beijing domestic and international rhetoric about what it wants in long term in Asia Pacific and globally. So much aggrandizing national strength has been transforming China's intentions or aspirations. However ambiguous or insufficiently self-conscious, they were sometime and somewhere. However, President Xi Jinping's ascending to top position in China and extraordinary speedy, complete concentration of power in his hands alone, was still a decisive factor in the transformation of national intention. President Xi Jinping believes his perceived Chinese and communist basic values, aspires his constantly declared resurgence of Chinese national greatness, intends seriously its realization at large, I believe, during his tenure, indefinite tenure, which was achieved through the revision of Constitution in early last year, puts a premium at his role as the supreme commander of China's armed forces, and is fully aware the domestic advantage he could win by a very pushing foreign policy agent. Since taking power at the 18th Party Congress held in November 2012, Xi Jinping has committed much more than his predecessors to exert China's strength and power, soft and hard. First, for widening and deepening China's involvement in world political economy and global governance, striving for leading role in some selected issue areas thereof. Second, for realizing China's economic and diplomatic preponderance in Asia mainland, and with somewhat less firm commitment and more flexibility in retrenchment, if required, other continents in the developing world. Preponderance is not over the native countries and societies, but over other great powers, topped by the United States. Third, for sooner or later, during his extra long tenure, compared with predecessors since Mao Zedong, obtaining at large China's strategic and military preponderance vis-a-vis the United States in the western part of Western Pacific, which extending from China's seacoast to the first island chain. China-U.S. rivalry can be characterized mainly by two main fronts of contention: strategic and trade winds, together with newly accelerated ideological in nature and power influence striving in essence. At the strategic front, structural trend since 2008, when global financial crisis and economic recession broke out, until Donald Trump elected as US president, was starting of strategic rivalry between Beijing and Washington, with the situation simplified as Hu Jintao versus Barack Obama, and then Xi Jinping versus Barack Obama. China-U.S. arms race over Western Pacific and even beyond became increasingly intensified, broadened, and prominent, especially after Xi Jinping's ascendancy to power. This race was conducted by both powers at the sea, in air, subspace, and outer space. Maritime rivalry in both South and East China Seas was under world's limelight, with Beijing and Washington declaring totally opposite legal position and having occasionally maritime military confrontation, accompanied by China's massive warship construction program, as well as drastic massive land reclamation, which greatly strengthened Beijing's position of military strength in South China Sea, and by U.S. freedom of navigation operations, which denied Beijing's claimed rights by showing arms. There had been also severe disputes between China and most Southeast Asian maritime countries over maritime territory, as well as exclusive economic zones, EEZ, together with very dangerous armed confrontation with Japan, the single most important military ally, maybe besides Israel, of the United States in the world. As a vital part of President Obama's rebalancing diplomatic competition against China's influence along China's periphery was remarkably advantageous to the United States at the time, relying on his administration's diligence and so-called smart power, and China's related force in peripheral foreign policy at that time. Moreover, closely connected with all the above, China-Russia strategic military cooperation was escalated along with intensifying of both Russia-U.S. and China-U.S. strategic antagonisms. At the trade front, although the situation was much better than the suddenly emergence of a trade war initiated by President Trump in mid last year, but all the major structural elements for confrontation had already there, which increasing prominence since 2008. The story was Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping versus Barack Obama. Of course, China has had complaints against the United States at the trade front, especially non-recognition of China's status as a nation of market economy and severe restriction of American high-tech export to China. But US and EU complaints and anger against China has been much severe and plausible to most international audiences. They have focused on 4 fields, which have been regarded by more and more governments and the public as more and more important or even vital to their economic welfare and fundamental security. These were first, the enormous China's trade surplus or their deficits. Second, China's largely static or even narrowing market access to U.S. and other advanced industrial countries' capital. Third, state control of China's domestic economy and foreign economic activities, which under Xi Jinping has been regarded as almost comprehensive, turning back to commanding economy. With so-called theft of intellectual property, an emerging Made in China 2025 program regarded as most disturbing and even threatening. Fourth, comparing with foreign enterprises in China and Chinese private enterprises, special preference given to China's state-owned enterprises, so-called SOEs, with massive subsidies. China had enjoyed liberal economic globalization. To enjoy, to lead the gradually clear words on the wall, enough is enough. Liberal economic globalization has been increasingly unpopular and even hateful to increasingly numerous voters in the United States as well as in many other advanced industrial countries, perceived by them as exploitative or even destructive to their job and welfare. At the same time, more and more strategists there have smelled from it losing of strategic preponderance because of losing economic technological one. Something exactly speaking, complaint was nothing, angry was nothing, except for slow and perceived responsive measures. There had been almost no substantial revision of China's practice on trade and business, but only largely now we remember radical and non-specific promises. With Xi Jinping's Sito speech in September 2015 as the most notable example. In other words, China had not realized that time is running out. Liberal economic globalization, which had benefited China greatly since China joined WTO, is losing much of domestic social and political basis in the United States, and perhaps also most of the other advanced industrial nations. Obama's limited politeness in these areas, backed by his liberal beliefs, together with China's slow downturn in GDP growth rate and increasing financial risks, only aggravated the potential severity of the problem. Politeness and the liberal beliefs mattered. In despite of his vigorous strategic rivalry against China, with strategic, diplomatic, and economic rebalancing, President Obama anyway made 3 major or even historical agreements with President Xi. First, agreement for addressing climate change, which constituted the basis for global Paris Climate Change Accord. Second, agreement to prevent clash between Chinese and American warships and war airplanes, an urgently required result of intensifying China-U.S. strategic military rivalry. Third, agreement on cyber security, also a result of the intensifying strategic economic competition. One cannot help to have a feeling of nostalgia when one looks at the China-U.S. relationship under Donald Trump now. Throughout 2017, strategic front situation occupied most attention of both Xi and Trump when they deal with China-U.S. relations. while trade front situation only secondary, and for Trump, accelerate. Trump had a strategy toward China throughout that year, 2017. That was to make China-U.S. relations, which has been so wide and so complicated, a prison of a single issue, the issue of North Korea nuclear and missile development, which had been almost the most difficult in the world to solve and even to be substantially influenced. Therefore, in addition to his notoriously wild, volatile, and Machiavellian personality, the seemingly wonderful atmosphere of China-U.S. relations since Xi-Trump Mar-a-Lago summit would almost necessarily erupt in a short time span of less than 3 months. At the same time, the Chinese influence upon North Korea had been reduced very much, or even to virtually nothing, while North Korea's hostility toward China had increased greatly. China seemed to be tamed, largely through Trump's extraordinary threat of military strike against North Korea and of so-called second sanction against China. After Trump's election as president to the end of 2017, China endorsed with reduced limitations 6 or 7 American draft Security Council sanction resolution against North Korea. Finally, almost to a degree of strategic strangulation. Beijing has been near to exhaust completely its instrumental pleasure against Pyongyang, while the corresponding political and strategic costs, especially the possibility of making North Korea become China's permanent enemy, would necessarily be high. Let alone such an action would be very easy to give an impression to the world as submission to American pressure. In South China Sea, throughout 2017, Trump administration's operation of freedom of navigation surpassed Obama's in both frequency and intensity, together with the highly publicized initiative for quadrilateral, that is U.S., Japan, India, Australia, Indo-Pacific Strategic Coalition, for checking China in South China Sea and some other regions. Besides, bilateral has become the administration's standard adjective to define China's economic practices in developing world, better know the initiative in the first place. Moreover, the concept of so-called sharp power and accusation of China's ideological drive within the advanced countries emerged, reflecting a new dimension of China-U.S. rivalry. At trade front, the situation throughout 2017 was surprisingly quiet, surprisingly because of the countless threatening words issued by Trump with American first flag during his election campaign. Trade truce was won by China's numerous big concessions made to Trump over North Korea, constituting the only onion China got through those years. Structural problems are still there. China's enormous trade surplus, static or even narrowing market access, and state control of economic technological activities are still what Trump aspires to target with widespread congressional public sympathy in his China dealing. Also remarkable is that Trump proved to be a brutal strategist and tactician by his behavior on North Korea problem in relation with Beijing, focusing on one major issue at one time in his dealing with China, never have more than one major front at a definite time, and imposing terrible pressure and threats with occasionally casually to squeeze the ears as much as possible from the opposite side. And he has been brutal. This is notorious symbol of the world. But so few people have not realized he has been a strategist by instinct, at least in his China relations dealings, because his instinctive actions compatible with both principles of strategic concentration and strategic initiative. In early last year, we almost suddenly found an extraordinary picture of severe rivalry or even confrontation between Beijing and Washington at both trade and strategic fronts, and even more. Having used up China's utility on North Korea, it seemed that President Trump began to apply the generally same strategy and tactics to the China-U.S. trade front. Successive brutal threats to impose high tariffs on China's export to the United States. Maximum demands raised to squeeze concessions as huge as possible. Tough negotiation positions alternated with a little softer ones. Almost last-minute mercy, so-called mercy, as casually shown to Beijing on destructive ZTE sanction. All are familiar Machiavellian approaches he employed at large in his dealings over North Korea problem. China seemed to have no other option except, after a period of trade revenge, making huge concessions on trade surplus and market access broadening, and quite reluctantly on Trump-labeled so-called strategic changes and industrial policies. Otherwise, might have to conduct a real protracted trade war, making China economy and finance suffered a lot. Moreover, this could only result in a temporary truce, and there will be necessarily, one after another, rounds of threatening trade war initiated by Trump for his American first. Time is running out. The bilateral adjustment will certainly be more expensive than otherwise, though they are also required for China's own high-quality development, rightly defined by President Xi as grand national objectives. At the same time, Trump has much intensified the rivalry against China at the strategic front. In mid-December 2018, the National Security Strategy of the United States of America was published by the White House. China, along with Russia, are defined as United States rivals, which, quote from this document, challenge American power, influence, and interests, attempting to erode American security and prosperity, determined to make economies less free and less fair, to close their militaries, and to control information and data, to repress their societies and expand their influence. 1 month later, Pentagon published 2018 National Defense Strategy of the United States of America, stipulating from military angle the strategy of, quote, retaining to U.S. strategic competitive edge relative to China and Russia. In mid-March 2018, when Trump signed Taiwan Travel Act, the second major legal statute following Taiwan Racing Act enacted in 1979, unleashing so-called legitimate high-level official visits and the direct consultation between U.S. and Taiwan if U.S. president decides requiring any equation case by case. Public or secret military ties with Taiwan is closer and would be even further closer under Trump, together with some dramatic diplomatic support given to Taiwan for opposing against or blackmailing China. Moreover, the more frequent, intensive, and allies-supported freedom of navigation operations, the advocacy for Indo-Pacific quadrilateral strategic coalition, the technological renewal of U.S. strategic armed forces, almost all across the region, has been launched by Trump and will probably be intensified in the future with probable new additions. Now we turn to trade war. The trade war with the United States imposed on China brutally by Trump since July 6 last year as the first one has been followed by escalated second one. The first one is 25% high tariff on 34 plus 16 billion US dollars Chinese export. The second escalated round is up to now 10% high tariff imposed on 200 billion Chinese export to the United States. Or even possibly would followed by third. That is 10%, and then a few months later, possibly 25 high tariff on additional 267 billion US dollars Chinese export. Although, and both governments in very generalized and ambiguous language told us, the trade talk seems that go well. And I still dare not to completely believe this. And making China's all 520 billion US dollars annual export to China inflicted by high tariff, accompanied by this later half of the trade war, various including numerous and strict measures to restrain China's high-tax trade and development. This will not change. And even trade talks and achieved wonderful fruits. Trade war have two components. First is not so critical, high tariffs against each other. Second is real, almost contain China's high-tech development and trade. This will not be changed. So trade war is tech war. Tech war is strategic war without guns and missile. Moreover, at this moment, even a temporary truce for the high tariff part of the U.S.-China trade war are not included with, which should be emphasized again, its unchangeable part of increasingly comprehensive and strict restriction imposed on China's high-tech trade and development could still be difficult to be achieved because Trump's focus on forcing implemented changes in China's economic mode and industrial policies, with the constantly repeated concrete and harsh demands for stopping first so-called stealing American intellectual property rights Second, so-called forced technology transfer by American enterprise in China. Third, special preferences with huge subsidies extended to Chinese SOEs by the Chinese state. Though the last one has been somewhat diluted in the resumed round of trade talks of the Trump-Xi summit on December 1st last year. But in the trade talks in Beijing last week, the American side suddenly and brought this state subsidy to SOEs almost completely in the front at the table. So Trump is really unpredictable. Unpredictability is one essential part of his brutality. The trade war in the context of China's pre-existing economic vulnerability is definitely a historical event. Historic event. It has forced China to prioritize its somewhat diffuse foreign policy agenda, diffused since the 18th Congress 6 years ago. The first priority of China has thus become, without question, the dealing with the trade war with the United States to protect China's vulnerable domestic economy and finance from being damaged too much as to destabilize China socially. On the basis of more comprehensive, more speedy, and more deep, at least economic reform. The clear orientation has just been set for applying stability maintenance in China's way one directly to Chinese economy and finance, and making it the number one of China's state affairs. Therefore, the strategic front, including North Korea proper, operations on Taiwan, and South and East China Seas, arms race with the United States over Western Pacific, strategic military cooperation with Russia, and the Belt and Road Initiative, I believe, has been devolved to secondary status as a whole, especially because of the above development of trade war and economic financial vulnerability, in addition to the rapid decrease of available national resources. Moreover, for the same reason, I believe, the strategic front itself will be retrenched remarkably in comparing with the situation in the past 6 to 7 years. At the strategic front, only operation on Taiwan and arms race with the United States in Western Pacific would be taken as a priority in comparing with other strategic affairs. And even them might, I guess, become milder than in the recent past. This is great. This new prioritizing is definitely a blessing to China's diplomacy. For with the theme of accommodation, rapprochement, mutual consultation, and winning friends in the world as many as possible, it would surely be part at planning. And a comprehensive improvement of relations with neighbors, including such an important neighbor as Japan, and which has been so prominent throughout 2017 and beyond, will be continued and developed. I often ask myself a major question. What should be the grand strategic imperative for China from now on to the future? For obtaining an answer, we ought to review the recent past. In retrospect, I believe, although China achieved under Xi Jinping extraordinary great achievements in foreign relations in the past 5 or 6 years. But there were also important defaults or regrets. In a summary way, the defaults and regrets is China on one hand jumped too high and too quick at the strategic front for increasing China's own gains. And at the same time, on the other, did so little at the trade front for reducing others' losings, at least others' perceived losings. A major result thereof was to help to mobilize, as it were, China's antagonists. So, the imperative, I believe, for a period from now on could be defined as conducting a new type of taking a low profile while doing something. In Deng Xiaoping's words, throughout the next 5 or 6 years or so, at least, according to strategic common sense of combining tension with relaxation, or taking a step back into 2 steps. That means China should make a strategic retrenchment in a sufficiently great degree, while conducting in a great leap forward manner the improvements of China's trade practices at least in next 5 or 6 years. A major strategic purpose of doing so is to strive for, as it were, demobilization of China's antagonists. Therefore, before making new advances. So China's strategic vision and stamina will be tested in this way. Since early last year, a dangerous possibility, at least fueled by me, of so-called dichotomy or decoupling or disintegration, and as you like to use any words, began to emerge, at least implicitly, in the dramatically changing world political economy. On the one hand, the U.S. government is inclining to greatly mitigate the economic and trade rivalries with other advanced industrial economies and their closed partners, a closed pattern like South Korea and Mexico, through bilateral negotiations, and may reach with them with increasing probability free trade or pan-free trade arrangements. Moreover, after demolishing global WTO regime by whatever means, WTO, now we feel its great advantage is global. If we have no WTO, if WTO and would be dismantled by any US president, by any means, we will lose a global regime in world political economy. And after that, my hunch is United States would probably build with other advanced economies and their close partners a new set of trade rules which would at large only cover the developed world and its closed partners. On the other hand, China, and by this I believe a realistic imagination, with comprehensive civil aggregation of rivalries with the United States, with the probable situation I just have mentioned of so-called group economy and trade, and having begun to strive for its own battle load system, the nature of the international power bloc under its own leadership might have no other option except increasingly depending on the friendly developing countries to conduct China's primary foreign economic activities. If that situation happens, these economic activities would only have a relatively poor prospect of profit for China and its developing partners. China's capital might outflow with little or even no payoff. Tangles with various other developing peoples and societies, and the related risks resulting would remarkably increase, accompanying with China's very wide, deep, and speedy involvement in the different areas of developing world. While at the same time, all these would not and could not bring to China what China really and most required, high tech in its broad sense. So after this imagination, conclusion is simple. China must do its utmost for striving to reduce or even eliminate this possibility of so-called dichotomy of world political economy. Otherwise, I believe China's national long-term prospect would be damaged in a historic degree. So from such a perspective, the protracted and as great as possible improvements of relations with Europe, with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, and I believe with Canada, is definitely greater in their historical significance. I have confidence. You look back, history of China Communist Party. You look back, history of People's Republic of China. Sometimes, and we ourselves commit disasters. Sometimes, and even frequent, there is big and small, tortures and setbacks. But up to now, this party and this republic prove itself still have, and if I quote the one of the first, brilliant Chinese hand in the United States, Professor Andrew Nelson, Australian resilience. Up to now, and China is still here, there across the Pacific. And of course we have new challenges, new, the difficulties and unexpected obstacles, both domestic and international. But according to past experience, not only experience of Deng Xiaoping, but even experience of Mao Zedong, this party, this republic, seems still have capability to adapt to change. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Professor Shi has made an extraordinarily wide-ranging and important series of statements about U.S.-China relations. In fact, they're so rich I don't know where to begin, and in that sense I will probably say many things that overlap with what he has to say, but in obviously my own voice rather than his. So I would argue that when we're discussing recent U.S.-China relations and rivalry, it is convenient to use the shorthands of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. And clearly both have significant responsibility for the situation we find ourselves in. I would emphasize, however, that they are only part of the story. Over the last 5 years or so within the U.S., major elements of the U.S. executive branch, the Congress, and many interest groups have become much more critical and in some cases actively hostile to the PRC. I'm fairly sure that Donald Trump would never think to call China a revisionist power, but that is what the national security strategy of the U.S. emanating from the Pentagon did. Similarly, Donald Trump didn't pay much attention to Made in China in 2025. But the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, the Department of Commerce, and numerous U.S. corporations did. Congress and human rights organizations have highlighted what some call cultural genocide in Xinjiang and the ramifications of the social credit scores and the apparatus that lies behind social credit at a time the State Department only seems to care about human rights in Venezuela. I could give other examples, but at this point, the point is almost all elements of the U.S. government and those groups and organizations in U.S. society who care about China have shifted significantly to a more critical stance. Today, those in favor of good U.S.-China ties, however good is defined, are some in the business community, but certainly a smaller number than before. Many educational institutions, Chinese Americans, and other Americans who have developed close people-to-people ties with Chinese. They appear to be in the definite minority. And even if Donald Trump agrees to a trade deal, it's not going to return U.S.-China relations to the good old days, whenever they may have been. How competitive or rivalrous and or hostile our relationship will be is of course something that we will only know in the future. It is harder to read the societal and governmental interests and forces that make Chinese foreign policy more than what Xi Jinping says. Professor Shi, in writings stretching back to at least 2012, if not earlier, has warned of China's 战略透支, or strategic overdraft, overstretch, perhaps sometimes translated as hubris. Clearly, this preceded Xi Jinping's ascension. A China with the same size GDP at PPP, purchasing power parity with the U.S., according to the Magnuson Project, doesn't see the need to hide its light under a bushel, Tao Wang Yang Wei. This sense of empowerment came from China's own successes as well as the global financial crisis. Whether China's long-term results are as successful as they seemed in 2009, 2010, and whether global capitalism's weaknesses were as severe as they seemed at that time is an open question. The confluence of these two governmental societal-wide sets of interests, views, emotions, etc., does not bode well for the future of U.S.-China relations. Donald Trump is unique among American presidents, but besides his gender, he shares at least one other thing with U.S. presidents since 1945. And that is, the U.S. must maintain preponderance of power in the international system, a goal set by Harry Truman, documented beautifully in Melvin Loeffler's history of the early Cold War. And that is this predominance the United States feels it is incumbent upon the United States to maintain in the international system. Trump's means to pursue this preponderance is different than his predecessors, and it is likely to backfire in many ways. But his goal of preponderance has been a constant, and it is likely to feed into ever greater competition, rivalry, and hostility. The U.S. has no right to expect it should or will always be predominant, but the political mainstream continues to see this as a fundamental national requirement. This leaves little room for China to rise much further or higher. Given political polarization in the United States, woe be to any U.S. politician who argues for accommodating or appeasing China. I'll not discuss the possibility of military conflict with China. Taiwan, South China Sea, Senkaku, Diaoyu, Korea are all dangerous overlapping areas where miscalculations can lead to war, even accidents lead to war. But there are other results already beginning to appear. It is clear the U.S. desires to limit Huawei in areas outside of China. Given what appears to be Huawei's superior 5G technology, this means development of different standards for 5G, and as some have called it, the development of a splinter net. According to news reports about the trade negotiations, the biggest stumbling block is over U.S. attempts to ensure that the Chinese state and state banks won't provide subsidies for emerging high-tech sectors in China. The goal is to maintain U.S. technological dominance. Needless to say, U.S. technological dominance and Chinese dependence on U.S. technology is unacceptable to patriotic Chinese. As global supply chains begin to be reoriented out of China, they will not return, causing economic distress in China and probably higher costs and prices elsewhere. Cooperation between the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases on climate change will be non-existent. Suspicion will fall on those in both societies who see the need for a way out of hostility. The costs are very high, and how to get out of the situation is much harder to see. Thank you.
I enjoyed the meeting and listening to Professor Shi in China just about a month ago, and I also enjoyed his comprehensive statement about U.S.-China relations. I'm going to be fairly brief and take what I call an outside-in point of view. That is to say, I believe the choices available to the leaders of both China and the United States in the next few years, I would argue in the next few decades, are going to be limited not so much by their choices as by the structure and dynamics of the international political economy. We had a lecture here a few days ago by a very distinguished professor of economics from Harvard University, who is president of the International Economist Association. He was talking about the future. And the future, in his mind, was a recreation of the Cold War Bretton Woods arrangement. I questioned that in the discussion period by pointing out he had not used the word technology even once, although we're in the middle of a technological revolution, the early stages of a technological revolution that is fundamentally changing not just the way we make and consume things, but the dynamics and structure of the international system itself. No one knows where that is going, but for sure, cybersecurity and related internet communications will change the way the world works, making us more interdependent than ever. And this, I disagree a bit with what David said, not so much in his assessment, but in what we have to do as the world becomes more interdependent. It would be a huge mistake not to try to accommodate China or to develop a working relationship with them. Because the second component that was ignored in the lecture of this gentleman from Harvard, Mr. Rodnick, was the fact that power has shifted and that there is nobody, neither the intelligence services, well, President Trump dismisses them, or the international banks that say that China alone will be bigger than the United States economically in a very short time. And East Asia, just throw in Southeast Asia, as well as Northeast Asia, will be, by purchasing power parity, perhaps already is, bigger than North America. Now, to project the future when this kind of a power shift, as well as a technological revolution is underway, is, to put it modestly, wrong. Now, I'm quickly going to go through just a list of the response to this situation, first by the United States. We have no grand strategy. Indeed, President Trump says we don't even need a policy, far less a strategy. We need the proper attitude. And by taking that position, he has basically rendered irrelevant what I just said, namely his attitude, however uninformed it might be, or whoever succeeds him, is sufficient. Similarly, the so-called foreign policy establishment in the United States, of which Donnie Roderick is a member, I assure you, answer is to recreate what we did in the past, which is equally inadequate. We have no strategy. It's not just Donald Trump's idiosyncratic behavior. It's the foreign policy elite of the United States does not have an answer. Moreover, President Trump has achieved several remarkable things. He has destroyed both international as well as domestic institutions relating to foreign affairs, rendering difficult finding venues that could even address the need for a new strategy and improve relations with China. Indeed, we have asserted that nationalism is going to make America great again, when nationalism in the 20th century led to 3 hegemonic wars and is demonstrated, I hope unequivocally, that using that as the definition for the future would be a mistake. Now, the United States, and the last point I would make about the United States is what David rightly and very clearly articulated, is the anti-China mood. This meeting, and the initiative coming from Chinese students, I might add, is a wonderful way to demonstrate the importance of establishing constructive relations in the short run. I totally share the idea that in the short run, nobody in Washington is going to embrace China. The articles that appear almost daily in the New York Times are anti-Chinese and dismissive of any possibility of dealing with them except as an enemy, comparable, I suppose, only to Iran. That's very dangerous. Now, what has China done in this context? Again, Professor Shi has done a nice job of summarizing what is going on there. They have a grand strategy. I'll discuss it briefly in a moment. It's called the Belt Road Initiative. It's probably comparable to the notion of containment, which George Kennan created for us when we were projected to be world leaders at the end of World War II. It's a multi-billion dollar, actually $1 trillion, multi-decade ambitious program to cement communications with Asia in the most extensive sense of the word, including parts of Africa that border the Indian Ocean, so that Europe and Asia, in the fullest sense of the word, are united. This involves a tentative multilateral institution, but it basically is a multilateral institution, as I'll describe in a moment, that serves China's national interests much more than it does create a world like the one we created to win the Cold War, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so forth, which were very costly for us, and now our public is reacting against that. On the other hand, China has created multilateral institutions beyond the Belt Road Initiative. The Shanghai Cooperative Organization, set up in the late 1990s, deals with that. Now, the 2 final points I want to make are, one is domestic politics it shapes the way these people will respond. And I'm not optimistic about how that's going to work in either country. It's not just that the personalities of President Trump and Xi Jinping are critical to all of this. They are resting, their positions depend upon support from people and party, in the case of China. Now, the implications of the world I have just discussed are, I will end with just two specific policy comments. One is that of the Belt Road Initiative, called BRI in China. It is a policy built around infrastructure investment, providing finance, technology, and usually Chinese workers to do the job. It does not even touch the issue of geopolitics or nationalism or religion in the Middle East, for example. It therefore is, however successful in the short run, it will fail in the long run, in my opinion, unless they figure out a way to be leaders that transcend money. The same is with Korea. Discussion about Korea, Clark Sorensen will deal with more effectively. I want to put it in an international context. Korea's division was internationalized by the so-called six-party talks, which China hosted, I might add, but which America participated in by saying we would not talk unless they agreed to complete irreversible denuclearization. That's still our policy. That's not going to happen. China will not, or North Korea will not give up nuclear weapons, not because Trump has suggested he convinced them through smiles and handshakes this is going to happen. It will be a bargaining chip that will be used against whom? Not the United States. He's not going to take out Seattle or San Francisco. It's absurd. He knows he'll be destroyed. It will be a bargaining chip against China. They are the ones that are stuck with the problem because of their proximity to China and the need for a bargaining chip to deal with their biggest neighbor. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank Professor Shi not only for his forthright presentation, but his willingness to respond to turbulent American weather as well as turbulent American politics. Professor Hellman noted that from the American standpoint, there is a long-term global strategy of the Chinese Communist Party. And I would add that that strategy, I would ask if that strategy also involves combining authoritarian rule at home while challenging the international system built by the United States and other democracies. One way the Communist Party of the Soviet Union attempted to hold its society together was by directly challenging the United States. But unlike the Chinese party, the ruling Soviet party failed to combine authoritarian rule with the development of a modern society capable of very high levels of economic productivity, per capita consumption, world-class science and technology, and social cultural cohesion. But I wonder if the Chinese dream, combined with Xi Jinping thought, constitutes a strategy for keeping the Chinese Communist Party in control of a modern and dynamic Chinese society, partly by relying on an external policy of overtly challenging the liberal international order established during the Cold War by the United States and other democracies. That said, I am sympathetic to some of Professor Shi's observations. David Bachman has noted that much of the American establishment is seeing a threat from a rising China. But to me, that's an almost separate issue from what President Trump has been doing, which has been to abandon the domestic socio-political values which have held together the international coalitions of Western states for both military and economic purposes. In confronting China, is Trump abandoning the values of a multilateral, multicultural coalition for the exclusionary values of an America First agenda? I will now cite an answer to this question given 62 years ago by the original author of America's anti-Soviet containment doctrine, George Kennan. In 1957, after a series of public lectures for the British Broadcasting Company, Kennan published a book entitled Russia, the Atom, and the West. His book addressed the dramatic rise of Soviet strategic nuclear weapons capabilities, of Soviet conventional military power, of greatly influenced Soviet influence in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and what at the time seemed to be very dynamic rates of growth in the Soviet economy, and what seemed to be Soviet dynamism in fields of scientific and technological innovation. In 1957, Kennan wrote, "When I am asked by my own countrymen how best to counter the Soviet threat, my reply is that we must first address our own failings. These are the racial problems in the United States, the conditions of our big cities, the education of our young people, our national environment, and the growing gap between specialized knowledge and popular understanding." Last fall, Robert Kagan, a Republican foreign policy specialist who worked for John McCain, has made a similar case to me that in facing the real external challenges that the United States faces, particularly from the Russian Federation, he argues that the main threat to the system of multilateral multiculturalism that links the United States to its allies in the Asia Pacific and to its allies in Europe is coming from within. And his examples are the United States and the United Kingdom, in addition to right-wing parties in Europe. And he warns of the toxic subterranean streams, political streams in U.S. history involving racism and nativist nationalism directed at both domestic and foreign targets. I think the question that all American citizens are facing in regard to Trump's America First program in regard to China is this: that if we abandon the constitutional, liberal, social, economic values of a multicultural society at home, how can we possibly sustain a liberal, multinational, multicultural alliance abroad? And without such a coalition, how can the United States possibly manage a successful rivalry with the Communist Party of China? Thank you.
I'd like to thank Professor Shi for a wide-ranging and very interesting discussion of China-U.S. relations. I'm going to confine myself to talking about the Korean Peninsula, which is my area of expertise. But the Korean Peninsula is kind of the fulcrum of Northeast Asia. You can't talk about the Korean Peninsula without talking about North Korea, South Korea, China, the Russian Federation, Japan, and the United States. So they're all linked together. Now, if you were thinking about just the US, China, North and South Korea over the past couple of years, you would have noticed that under President Obama, China and the United States were actually cooperating on a sanctions regime worked through the United Nations Security Council. They got tighter and tighter over a period of about 10 years as North Korea developed its nuclear program. That reached the point, however, where the US got exasperated because North Korea wasn't listening, wasn't responding to the sanctions, and decided to introduce THAAD missiles, that is, terminal high altitude missile defense system into South Korea. And this was the last straw for China, because the main reason China wanted North Korea to not develop a nuclear program, of course they didn't like the nuclear program, but they could live with it, is that it might motivate the United States to introduce more weapons into Northeast Asia and South Korea in particular, and it might motivate Japan to develop its own nuclear weapon, or even South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapon. So far, the US has prevented both Japan and South Korea from doing that, but that's the nightmare that China has. Now, when South Korea accepted the THAAD missiles, China, this was in 2016, at the very last year of President Obama's administration, China got really angry and boycotted South Korean cultural exports. You know, their boy bands couldn't go to North China anymore, where they're really popular, and other things like that, which is a big blow to South Korea because their economy is extremely dependent upon trade with China. China is by far their most important export target, much larger, and trade with China is much larger than their trade with Japan or the United States or any other place for that matter. So South Korea is highly dependent upon China. So in 2018, President Moon Jae-in, who had just been elected, the South Korean president, went to China and negotiated with them. And it seemed like it was a triumph for China that Moon Jae-in agreed to the so-called 3 no's. The 3 no's meaning no more missiles deployed in South Korea, no South Korea joining in regional missile defense system, and no US, Japan, South Korea alliance against China. So this was in 2018. So it seemed like China was getting what it wanted. Now, being an anthropologist, I want to change positions and kind of put ourselves in the North Korean point of view, because I think, in fact, North and South Korea have a lot of agency in the current situation in Northeast Asia. And we don't think about that Asia in the US. We think, well, the US acts, China acts, maybe Russia or Japan acts, but they don't think about North and South Korea acting. So let's go back to 2016 in North Korea. North Korea in 2016 had its 7th Party Congress. That is, a Korean Workers' Party conference, the Communist Party of North Korea. And in the wake of that conference, they came up with a comprehensive plan for sprinting to nuclear weaponization. And that comprehensive plan had a foreign policy basis to it. They thought to themselves, okay, 2016 is an election year in the United States. It's going to be until the end of 2017 before the new president, whom they thought would be President Clinton rather than President Trump, but would be able to fill all the positions in the government, create a coherent policy, and so forth. So the US is going to be preoccupied in 2017. In 2018, at the end of 2018, they were expecting a South Korean election. In actual fact, it took place earlier because of the impeachment of President Park, but we won't go into that. And so they expected the US and South Korea to have a hard time negotiating their new policy in 2018. So they saw this as a moment of opportunity to sprint toward nuclear weapons. And that's what they did. So throughout 2017, there were 2 more nuclear tests. There was missile tests, so that North Korea proved that it was able to send missiles to the U.S. mainland with nuclear tips, or at least had that potential. Now, we turn to 2018, and suddenly we get a charm offensive. And this was part of the plan because North Korea was self-consciously following the Pakistan and India model of nuclearization, which means you sprint yourself to nuclear weaponization, and then you announce a moratorium on nuclear testing and missile testing, and you start a charm offensive. And this is exactly what Kim Jong-un did in the early 2018. People visited the South Korean Olympics, and then President Trump, who in 2017 was calling Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man, and we were worried about an actual preemptive strike, decided to meet with President or Kim Jong-un, President of North Korea. Meanwhile, North Korea and South Korea were also meeting with each other. And notice how this changed everything in Northeast Asia, because China, they didn't want more U.S. weapons in Northeast Asia. So now that North Korea was negotiating with the U.S., China kind of pulled back from the sanctions regime, which they joined under President Obama. And Kim Jong-un, whom China had never met before, started meeting with Xi Jinping. They met several times very cordially. Kim Jong-un also met with President Trump. There have been meetings with the Russian Federation and so forth. So I want to suggest that both North Korea and South Korea have some agency in this issue between supposedly the U.S. and China over the North Korean nuclear issue, and that in fact they both exercised rather adroit diplomacy over the past 3 years, and North Korea is seeing the fruit of their strategy. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Because of the time limit, so we'll give the speaker's response Q&A together. So there are 2 microphones down here, and please address your questions. Be brief about your question and phrase it as a question. And please address the question to a specific speaker. And we'll have the speaker respond to the discussant's questions and comments at the first round.
Hello, I have a question for Professor Shi. Actually, 2 questions. One is, Professor Shi mentioned 2 fronts where China-U.S. rivalry occurs: the strategic front and economic or trade front. So I think of these 2, the trade area is probably the easier path where China could make concessions. But just like Professor Bachman just mentioned, unlike a lot of hotly debated topics within the U.S. politics, the harsh confrontation with China is pretty much a consensus within the 2 parties, the government and the Congress. So what if the U.S. demand is more than just economic reform, but rather, like more liberal political reform? How would you think China would deal with that? And my second question is regarding China's foreign relations. Professor Shi mentioned that China should seek collaboration with other international players in the international community. But the recent development is that the Eastern European countries are busy catching Chinese spies, and then Turkey just condemned China's treatment of the Uyghur concentration camps, which is very rare. And then Australia, last month, a Chinese-born Australian citizen got detained, and then Canada, of course, got caught with the Huawei incidents. And Canada has been pretty friendly with China. Even Canada was one of the few countries, even during Mao era, that had dealings with China. But the last I read, more than half of Canadians responded that they supported the assertive position with China. So what do you think, what's your take on this? What's your opinion regarding China's foreign relations opportunities? Thanks.
No, good questions, and thank you very much for the first question. I think the China-U.S. rivalry, I emphasize again and again, and happened generally in several fronts. Major fronts is trade war, and the now happen, and strategic front, and even have ideological front. But what is dramatically and clear phenomenon is that these fronts and the rivalry in different fronts are closely connected. And more and people in China, as well as in the United States, and become aware of this trade war, the essence. Most important thing are two from Trump's side. First, China must structurally change itself, economically, at least. The second, the high-tech trade and development of China must be contained. I think that personally, he and many in the United States, and I think that the Professor Bahman, I just referred to this, have a great determination to contain, in substance, China's high-tech development and trade. Otherwise, even me cannot, in long terms, and imagine how the United States can maintain its and also reduce, but still the power preponderance in the world in the future. So, and in China, and I can say that now, according to my best knowledge, no one, especially in IR cycle, and have any illusion that the United States will make major great concessions in the future to let China do the best and with foreign technology resources to develop the China high tech. And the Huawei case, really very strategic. And there is a close connection, especially in modern economy, of trade and strategic capability, because technology is a bridge. If we have and a trade preponderance finally, including technological, how can your country maintain your strategic preponderance? Oh, this is, I think that no one will and responsible statesman for their own nation or their own people will, in the long term, make quite a soft decision. Of course, and if you look at the United States, 19th century, 20th century, and more often was under great pressure and difficulties. And at first the British, then and the Second Reich of Germany, then both Japan, militarist of Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. Sometimes difficulties caused, stimulate a great people, do much more and achieve much more achievements under pressure. But this is not certain. And we found this great aspect of American people is just after, Americans successful to trump over their enemy. So, and the people at their practice are not so confident about the future. But sometimes, and both environment their own nature, including cultural nature, and narrow their choice, they only can do that. And so I think that the China, and as an empire in the past, and then, as a weak modern country, and then as an increasing strong country, existed in this earth at least 3,000 years. China is still there. So I think that the China have patience. Even sometimes China's top leadership have short patience. We have to live in China. We have lived to East Asia. And we have to gradually develop our, the capability of overseas power projection. But if there are difficulties, if there are obstacles, if all of those are too severe, you read China's historiography, 3,000 years, mainstream strategic idea are defined as strategic conservatism. So we can wait. If sometimes, in a period, the Chinese people and become too hurry and less patient then, and they will become and more patient in the next round. The American people is the same. And North America, at least half of that, is already occupied by American nation. It cannot be changed. So if overstructured, some president reflecting national interests will make retrenchment. Of course, success often will make people lost the sense, go quick. Then, if they found some, they will adjust their national and agenda. I have full confidence. Both Chinese people and American people is so different from, Japanese nation and German nation in a short historical period. So both our two countries are great countries. But what is modernization compatible with what Professor Haussmann said? This globalization, this interdependence, made the values become more and more same. You want oil. We now also want oil. You love, after carries. We learn from you. We also should have after carries. So interdependence never assured that international rivalry will become more polite and less, intensive. This world, everyone wants the same thing. But sometimes, there's still a scarcity of strategic or economic or financial resources. So whole of the modern societies all over the world should learn something which is almost imperative in long term, to try to share as well as compete for scarce resources in broad sense. Second, China can learn, but China, because this nation have 1.4 billion people and have a party which is not very well known for quick adaptation to Chinese situation. So it will require time. You look at whole of the year 2017 until Kim Jong-un for the first time come to Beijing. Something miracle happened. I appeal for improved China's powerful diplomacy for more than 10 years. But when Xi Jinping realized this, he fixed it only at less than 1.5 years. Powerful diplomacy with Japan, with South Korea, of course. Sorry, China have not, realized directly any, results from the SARS sanction. And with North Korea, and with India, with Southeast Asian countries. Within less than 1.5 years, China's powerful diplomacy dramatically, comprehensively, much improved. So of course, and I believe what I said toward the end of the talk is I think China should do. This don't mean that China will do in a short time. Slow machine. And sometimes statesmen deal with immediate problems. For example, if China do nothing to punish, Canadian government's arrests under American demands and the COF of Huawei. And then if China do nothing, and there will be no China's private, entrepreneur or state entrepreneur dare to go to advanced countries. So, but of course, and nations and conducted by governments is not a very, very smart machine. It's a mechanical machine. But I firmly believe as long as the United States take a, you can say, antagonistic attitude to China, China have no choice. We will do our best in middle term and to make Europeans at least a minimum of Chinese friends. Japanese, Australians, South Koreans, and of course Canadians. We have no choice. Sooner or later, I think that the Chinese government will try to mitigate the pent crisis and in the relationship between China and Canada. But now it's not time because Chinese government is a slow machine. But if they change in a right direction, also, you cannot stop it for a short time. Good policy will last for a quite long, time span and produce important, the beneficial, the results for China, maybe in a less degree as well as for other countries. Thank you.
Professor Shi, thank you very much for the wonderful lecture and for my colleagues' comments. So I have a comment. I want to throw some ideas and then to provoke your better answers. I want to question your general theme of the rivalry between the United States and China. So the reasons to question that rivalry is to claim that there's no rivalry at all, and that is based on three fundamental weaknesses of China. So number one, China's prosperity of the last 4 decades seems to be quite dependent on the market, access to the market in the United States, European Union, and Japan. So it's hard to claim that other than these markets, China can achieve the prosperity. So now, given the change of political atmosphere, given the fact that the European Union is also joining U.S. in the trade issues, so it's hard to anticipate that this access to this major market will continue. And then, if that happens, then China's battle road will be road to nowhere. So which would be a fundamental question for China's prosperity, right? The second is institution. So you just talk about WTO as the real global organization, which is crucial. And I fully understand that because for somebody who teaches international trade law here. But then the question is, I can see China benefits enormously from the WTO, but I really don't see how China is a real significant contributor to the institution building of the WTO, right? Given the short history of China, given the fact that China's openness of its own market is still limited. So in that sense, where is the leadership of China in terms of global institutions, right? Even though that China has more voting power in World Bank, IMF, but to portray China as a true leader in the place of the United States, or even something close, seems to be still not within our sight at the moment, right? So in that sense, China seems the other way around, seems to be quite dependent on the institution designed, built by the United States, right? And then the third weakness is innovation. So we talk about technology, and that's a very important issue from Seattle. this region. And then the question, even though there's a lot of achievement in China, scientific papers is very, very impressive. But on the other hand, given the closeness of China's political system, given the censorship that is widely practiced in China, given the fact that Baidu has very, very limited search ability compared with Google, how Chinese smart scientists, engineers can have access to the information that is available to other scientists, can maintain or even to catch up and then maintain competitive edge, right? So with a political control, how can the Chinese scientists to be leaders in different fields and to be brave enough to bring new ideas, to bring therefore breakthroughs to different fields in science and commercialization of them, right? So with these three fatal weaknesses, how can we talk about rivalry between the United States and China?
I think that your comments and questions are...
So if anyone has any last questions, please repeat, because we have to end at sharp 6. So any last question? Okay, so we'll leave the next 5 minutes to Professor Shi to respond.
Thank you for your penetrating comments and question. And I think that the first two comments are relatively easy to be answered. I emphasize again and again in my talk, time is running out. Whole of the world bilaterally found that globalization and the state political economy of the world have huge problems, not in developing world, but just in, fortress of liberal democracy and capitalism. The problem, first of all, and emerging United States, in Great Britain, and in less degree in other advanced economies. But China, and I said in my speeches within China, I said that our world outlook have problems. We have not, adapted to fund the world change. So time is running out. So we have to pay even maybe much more high price and to catch up this dramatically change world situation. But China have no choice. And we have to increase our, this is not dependence. This is different from early, period of open law and reform. But we must do our best to keep as much as wide the market, especially for technology in advanced world. And I think especially Trump gave China a favor because he teaches China. We must change. We must change our, you can say economic model to make, of course, this require time. Because in my personal view that in the past decade, we almost do nothing. So we shall not expect that in a short time, we can make Europeans and Japanese or Austrians and become, more trust of our economy, the determination of opening. And we say too much, do too little. So our credibility today in this world is not very high. And so, but China have no choice. And if the United States treat China quite romantically, and this will do China great disfavor. And in China, so many people, potentially practically, always think that United States is most important. Someone even think that the United States is the only one important. Then we alienated. And when our relation with the United States, not so bad, we alienated those, other advanced nations. But Chinese people, and is a slower learner compared with the United States, American people. But we still learn. I don't think that in the long term, and our relations with other developed industrial countries, maybe except the United States, will have such protracted and formidable difficulties. I have confidence. The second is that China prepared to appeal to multilateral the institutions, existing institutions. China have to just realize China should not be only benefited by world political economy, should give, greater, even much greater contribution. But time is running out. The liberal world order already being dismantled by your president. China have no chance. China appeal for. You look at China's leaders, international statements, especially outside China, always appeal. We are still, maintenance. We benefit, and we believe you also, whole of the world benefited by, World War II, post-World War II, the international multilateral institutions at large, including United Nations, including IMF, including World Bank, and so on and so on. But Americans don't listen to this. It seems that, and represented by your president, and you are very hurried to dismantle this, post-World War II order, and under your leadership. Trump never referred to world leadership. Trump never referred to multilateral international institutions. Trump even, and until Vice President Pence make his, and in China notorious, Hilton Institute speech, and administration leaders in Washington never refer to human rights, democracy, and so on and so on. This is not China challenging international order. Maybe, and 10 years later, maybe if China might be challenged. But before China challenged this existing order, this order already is dismantling by your president. How can you blame China is a challenge? China is a challenge, is only in Western Pacific. We have to have our entitled strategic rights. If now is in a war condition or very near to war, our armed forces and cannot even across the middle line of Taiwan Strait, cannot go into the beyond the western part of Western Pacific without and triumphant battle with the United States. And how can you expect the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party and People's Republic of China and accept this kind of situation forever? No way. But of course, sometimes we go too quick. Sometimes, and we forget that power could have different tools, not only and GDP growth, economic strength, or military strength. But anyway, I think that this is the answer to second, the penetrating observation. Finally, this is quite difficult. Innovation. National experience is something nation depends on. And from perspective of our top leader, I guess he remembers so firmly that this state use this kind of commanding technology, make China become nuclear power, make China have much, much more high-speed railway than any other country combined. Then it's quite difficult to make him or his associates really believe that in the next campaign of technology development, for example, 5G, why this state and could not to use its, capability to mobilize a huge country to get, catch up and even go first. So, and Deng Xiaoping learned from facts, but facts is another set of facts. And especially Mao's failure in developing China economy and technology, and since middle of 1950s. So it depends on time. And the leaders have to learn, just as we ourselves. Learning requires time. And learning is relatively easy task. If you learn the truth, if you learn the best strategy, and you have to mobilize your people to follow you. And political is always a collective enterprise. So time. But I still believe that even if in the worst case, this round of China's rise are have setback, and next round, China will rise. And our history is such kind of things. But generally, I think that we are more strong and more, in relative sense, more liberal, and our people are generally richer and even very much than China in the first half of 20th century. But of course, if you read the Chinese history, whether ancient or modern or contemporary, zigzags and angerness, but also, and based on these, and great progress and successes. But of course, our most ancient philosophers, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, already teach Chinese own people. Success or failure is only temporary matter. Today's success do not assure tomorrow's success, let alone successful forever. So diligence is what most required for a nation. I think that in China, there are many, misperceptions of American people. Some simple guys think that American people only have one, talent to use credit card. But if Chinese people really believe this, then Chinese people will fail, because American people have another dimension, and occasionally or intermittently, and this kind of the dimension are overwhelmingly to this tribal American nation, just as your people in 19th century, especially after Civil War, and just as your people in the exact speaking during the First World War, and just like your people, and to under FDR, as the most important actor to make Nazi Germany and military Japan's dream broken. So now I fully agree with all of our American professor touched on or even said. Most important things is to make your home at good order, to find your own weakness and to change it, and never to obsess with so-called foreign antagonists. If you obsessed with, you will be failed by 90% chance. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Professor Shi, and all the panelists for exciting presentations. Our next two events for the end of this annual lecture series of this year will be the Professor Lai Goldstein from U.S. Naval War College. Since this panel we're talking about China-U.S. rivalry, the next speaker will finally bring us some solution to that in terms of its creativity and possible proposals, and that will be about meeting China halfway, how U.S.-China rivalry can be diffused, and that will be on April 8th. And our last special session will be with Professor Ji Wei-ci.
Two-finger intervention. Never really believe everything, every problem in the world, there would be a solution. Sometimes you have to exist with problems for a long time, then you pass over.
Thank you.
Do we have a date on the War College lecture?
Yes, that will be April 8th. It will be Monday at 4 to 6. Yes, at same place. Yeah. Thank you all for coming, and please give a round of applause to the panels.
Thank you. Good job.